There we go. Jess, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so welcome to the session today on how good communication skills will lead you to success. This is what we're going to be covering. So I wanted to set the context for this talk in the times we're in now, which is very much remote working, certainly for myself and I think for most people. And since the working culture that we live in has changed so much in the last few years, I wanted to talk about what that means for communication, what I've learnt during this time, and some remote working principles, which I'm hoping this will be a good takeaway for you to think about as you go forward in your careers. So I will talk to you about those principles, and then I will give you some tips for running meetings, workshops and presentations that you tend to do in most digital jobs, and async methods. And then I'll talk a bit about recognizing people, which is something that we do a lot in the company that I work in, currently called Workhuman, and I'll talk to you a bit about Workhuman and what we do towards the end of the presentation to give some context to that. So as we go through, do feel free to use the chat function, and I'm going to give you a quick intro to say a bit more about myself, and every time you see this slide it's meant to be interactive, so every time you see this white slide with the circles and pictures, feel free to type in the chat, where do you live currently, where are you calling in from, and what job do you want? So what are you looking to achieve in your career? Feel free to just keep typing stuff in, and I'll tell you a bit about where I am and my job at the moment. So I'm based in London in the UK, and that's a nice picture of London there on the left side. I work in user experience, and I have done for a number of years. I started out in market research when I first graduated, and pretty quickly moved into user experience design and research. And from there I did a master's degree in user interaction design, and then I started in business to business company called RBI, which is currently under the branding of LexisNexis RIZK. So it's a B2B data business, and there's from there I started working in UX roles and user research, and I worked my way up to be leading a team there, and hired set up a graduate scheme where I hired a number of designers, and there's a picture there on the right with me with that team, who are awesome designers and all working in the industry still. So I did that for a number of years, and then I started to work as a freelancer, set up my own company which is called Creative Product Consulting, and I did a number of roles, including working for the UK government briefly, doing some cryptocurrency, fintech, startup kind of stuff, and then I also ended up working in a company called Flatiron School, where I was teaching the design course, and that's where I worked with Bavik formerly. So that was a fantastic time. We had a great program there. And now I'm working at Workhuman, where I head up the product research function. So again, managing a team, and again in UX research, which I love. And it's all about finding out why people think the way they do, and what mental models people have, and how we can learn about people to apply that to the design process. So that's the kind of stuff that I really enjoy doing. So yeah, tell me a bit about yourself, and interested to find out who I'm talking to. I'll have a quick look at the chat so I can just see. So you're calling in from Turkey, Istanbul, and I can see there that you're interested in going into UX UI design, social media, project manager in tech. Oh, some people also coming in from Lebanon, Iraq. So welcome, yeah, welcome to everyone, and I hope there's something interesting for you here that you can take away. If you have any questions as we go through, you can use the Q&A function that's on the screen as well. So type those questions in as they occur, and there will be, I'm only going to talk for, I think it's going to be about 20 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A session where I'll cover any questions that you have, and happy to take your questions. And also should mention that I'm a cat lover, cat person. I don't currently have a cat, but I do like to have a cat picture in every presentation just to remind myself. And I'm sure when I have a bigger home, I'll get a cat. So this is to set a little bit of context around what working was like for me, and it might not have looked like this for everyone. This is quite location specific to London, but it just gives you a picture of kind of how working life was back in 2019. So the picture on the left was Earl's Court tube station, which was pretty close to where I live, and this was a bad day. It wasn't as bad as this every day, but it just gives you an idea of what commuting on a transport system could be like when there are a couple of delays or cancellations trying to get on the train. This was the typical working life, everybody trying to commute through the transport system at the same time of day, sometime between like 7:30 and 9:30 in the morning, trying to get to work. And I worked in the east side of the city, so I commuted west to east into WeWork, which is shown there. You might see a familiar face there, Bavik, on the modelling for the WeWork that we worked in, and this is over in Moorgate. This was so WeWork was where Flatiron School was based, and it's of course it's a great place to work, and office space which is very open and light, and there's a bar there which you can see, which was an interesting concept to have in an education program, but we had this great space to work in. So that was the context, generally going into an office, having face-to-face communication with people, everybody being there, so creating a kind of atmosphere from the fact that we were all together and co-located. So that was the context we were in. And as you know, working life is now very different. So from about March 2020, we took our teaching online. So we were over Zoom. So we're now the boxes on the screen. And pretty much that's the way I've been working ever since. So even in my new role, I joined remotely. My colleagues are mostly based in Ireland and in the US in Boston. So meeting people face to face, of course, during the pandemic as well, was very difficult. I did manage it after a year, a trip over to Dublin to meet a few of my colleagues, but for the majority of the time, it's been this kind of setup. So over Zoom, as we are now, looking at the chat and using Slack, using digital tools to do all of our communication. And that's important context because I think it has really changed the way we communicate. So here's another interactive slide. Tell me in the chat, how do you think that remote work changes communication? What have you noticed in the shift that you've seen? So feel free to suggest anything that you think has changed. Some of the things that I think have changed, we have more limited availability to make social connections. So as I said, I didn't meet my colleagues face to face that I was working with for a number of months. So all those connections were built digitally over Zoom calls. And I think when that happens, what you have is a setup where it's often meetings, it's meetings after meetings. It's rare to have the kind of informal chats that we would have had. So if you think back to the picture I showed you, we had these sofa areas, we had kitchens, we had a bar area where if you wanted to have an informal chat to someone, often that's where those kind of communications would have happened. But over Zoom, there isn't really that kind of atmosphere. It's hard to say to someone, can we just grab a coffee? Because grabbing a coffee means we bring our coffee to sitting in front of the Zoom call. So it's very similar to every other call. So having that lack of context change is something that I think I've definitely seen. The other thing is probably a reliance on written communication over verbal, because I'm using Slack a lot. We use emails. We need to be able to write down our messages. So maybe we are relying a bit more on written than we were previously relying on verbal. And I'm just going to have a look at your chat here and see what you've said. So yeah, you've lost the benefit of having a community in work. Yeah, understand. Communication is harder. Building connections is not as easy. Be active in remote work, and all digital activity will be more helpful to create good weather for communication. Yes. Sometimes feeling of isolation, and you saying that you love learning in real class, but you can't find one, and you're bored of online classes. Yeah. But you mentioned preventing wasting time commuting. Yeah, absolutely. Like those are all very valid points, and I agree with that. So to summarize, this is the point about isolation that someone has made in the chat. I think that I've noticed this feeling for myself anyway, and speaking personally. Everyone is an island, and I was living on my own for most of the last couple of years, so there was this feeling often of we had to stay in our homes pretty much anyway. So there was this feeling of, wow, we've just sort of been marooned on these islands, and we have this digital technology to communicate, but sometimes there can be this feeling of we're separate, we're dealing with things in isolation. And this is how I think it looks. If any of this sounds familiar to you, sometimes you're spending all day online in some form or another, on your computer, on your phone, wondering if you're doing a good job. It can be harder to understand that because you're in this kind of island, isolated mentality, struggling sometimes to build connections. And I don't know if anyone feels this, but sometimes losing focus and getting distracted. Working from home has a lot of advantages, but I can also get a little distracted by I need to put on a wash load, or I've got a lot going on around my environment that I need to remember. I need to do all these things, and sometimes because I'm physically in the same space where I do all my life stuff, I get a little distracted by things. But the good news is, and you've mentioned some of this already in the chat, but we don't have those commutes, and I showed you that picture, and that was not a good day. So we've lost that. We have got this ability to work from anywhere. I say ish because there are still some challenges with, maybe tax implications and where you can actually be based. But I think there's a huge, huge advantage to this. Of course, it opens up all sorts of opportunities for all sorts of people, and that's fantastic news. And there's more flexibility. So this is a great thing, I think. If you think back to the more rigid structures that we might have had when we worked in offices, it should be possible now to construct a life that works for us. So maybe you want to do different types of exercise, you want to take breaks, you might want to work different hours, might be convenient for you to work in a different on different time zones, and maybe you want to start earlier, finish earlier, or start later, finish later. Hopefully the working culture that we're starting to see allows for that. And then that point about developing yourself, particularly important hopefully for the people during this call, access to education programs, to mentors, support networks, teaching from all over the world. We hope to see talent growing, and we hope to see more globally diverse workforces in every company. So there's a lot of positives to come out of these changes. And so from your own experience, what kind of remote working tips do you have? So those of you who've, I'm sure, been dealing with these kind of changes as well, just type in the chat and I'll see kind of what you've been saying so far. So remote work gives a chance to meet people that is impossible to meet in the normal life. Yes, you are right, definitely. So it should enable you to connect with people who maybe you wouldn't have been able to meet. And it's the same for me and for everyone as well. I used to go to kind of networking events in London, and they were quite based on people that lived in that same city. I think now I would be more likely to join a global event and connect with all sorts of people in different countries. So that's been fantastic. Someone else mentioned, I think that remote work makes it hard to interact physically, makes it hard to develop emotional intelligence. That is a really good point. Really good point. I think because we lose a lot of connection through not seeing body language and not having people physically in front of you. It can be quite hard to understand the meaning that they're trying to convey. So that is a really good point. But on the other hand, you say that it makes the job easier in terms of transportation and emphasizes globalization. You're right. And introverts might feel more comfortable with such a job. That's a really good point. So I think, yeah, introverts and extroverts might react differently, and that's definitely something to think about. You say as well that making online community is easier. Yes, then yeah, that makes sense. Prefer to focus on the positives, definitely. always communicate on time when you have something blocking you from work, and over communicate. Yes, that is also one of my tips. So, and someone says you're here for tips. Well, good. I hope I can supply them on the next slides. So these are my remote working principles. So one of them you already got. So over communicate. Say it once, say it twice. So over communication, I think I've noticed that because of the fact that we are a little bit more disconnected, it's really important that sometimes you might need to send a couple of emails to someone to get through to them. I think when I'm managing a team, I have a message about what my team does around a company, and it's a big company. So I need to be very clear about what we're doing, what we can help with, what services we offer as a product research function. I need to be saying that multiple times to get my message across in different Slack channels, on Zoom calls. I need to be prepared to have a clear message and communicate it. The first point I think is really important. So we mentioned that we can feel isolated, and I've noticed that that can have an impact on mental health. So I noticed that when I've been sitting in a room on my own for hours and hours, and then someone will say something on Slack, sometimes I might think, oh, I wonder if they value me or know that I'm doing a good job, or maybe I need to do things differently. But assuming positive intent is really important. And I say this about being your own compassionate coach. This is something I've been looking into recently, but got into the idea of compassionate coaching is basically developing the voice in your head, which can sometimes be negative. So if you ever heard of like negative self-talk, that's when the voice in our head is telling us, oh no, maybe I'm not good enough for this role, or maybe I need to improve. We can develop a way of making that voice more positive. So it can be compassionate. We can say, actually, you're doing amazing with the circumstances that you're in, and you're hired for a reason. You're on this education program because you've got potential. So always remember that. And when you're looking at messages from people, assume that they are positive towards you, and that really helps, I've found. So that's a key principle. Then the other principles, empathy for others. So yes, everybody in the last few years especially has been going through different circumstances that can be difficult for different reasons. And when we work with people in all different countries, of course, every country is dealing with different dynamics. So having that empathy and being aware of what's going on for people and being kind is very important. And then seeking support. Sometimes it can be difficult to ask for help, but I think in remote work, it's more important than ever to raise your hand if you feel like you're stuck or you need help from people. Do that. Like, don't be afraid to ask, because again, it relates to that principle of over communication. But sometimes you need to be really, really clear and say, hey, I need something to do today, or I need you to help me with this. And I noticed that when people are joining jobs remotely, it's again important that they always make it clear what they need from the people around them, and that's a good way to operate. So looking at those tips, I'm going to show you how they apply to real situations that you're going to be in. So in each of these coming slides, we'll focus on a different context that you might be in when you're working, and I'll show you some tips, and they're all listed on the screen, so it's pretty straightforward for you to have a read through. So with the running of meetings, I think the principles of over communication and empathy are quite important. So here are some tips that relate to that, and hopefully I've demonstrated a couple of them. So giving guidance, video on or off, using the chat or not. We tried to give you some guidance at the beginning of this session about the fact we can't see you or hear you, but we know you're there through the chat, so please use the chat and also the Q&A. It helps to say that to people, because I'm noticing I'm in a lot of meetings and sometimes you don't really know what the expectation is. And if I'm doing a meeting where it's presenting lots of slides, I might say to people, just turn your video off if you want, because, you know, if the point is just me going through some information, it might not be necessary for people to have it on, and that might make them feel more comfortable. In other meetings where we're going to be having a conversation, if it's preferred, you might ask people to have the video on if they feel comfortable. So set that agenda, set that expectation. I put there about setting an agenda, and it can also be editable. We'll talk more about that later, but giving other people the chance to say, oh, I want to put something on the agenda, that helps with a meeting. I've noticed for introverts, which someone mentioned earlier, I'm also part of a networking group called Quiet Strength about introverts in the creative industries. And one of the things they do really well is they'll set up a meeting where they'll have on screen the names of the people in the session in order on the screen, and they'll say, we're going to ask each person for their input, and this is the order we'll be asking you in. And that can be very helpful because you're not having to worry about when to interrupt someone if you want to get your point across, which can be very hard if you're an introverted person on a Zoom call. You don't really want to have to sort of shout out your message and talk over people in the room. So if I tell you I'm coming to you third on the list and you're going to have a designated slot to speak, that might make you feel more comfortable that your point will be made at the chance where you'll have to speak, and you won't have to worry so much about interrupting. Tech issues always happen, so be calm for that and set just expect for yourself that it always happens, so no worries, you can recover. Zoom breakout rooms, if you've ever been on a Zoom call with breakout rooms, super helpful, especially for breaking a big group into smaller groups. I find that it's quite hard for more than 5 people to have a conversation on a call. So any time where you're asking people to discuss something, break them into groups, let them go off and discuss it, and then bring them back. And assume that people are multitasking. So I'm afraid I do this too. I'll be looking at my Slack whilst I'm in a meeting. I might be looking at my phone. That's why over communication is sometimes important, sending recaps and making sure that you get your message across, assuming that everybody's a bit distracted. And then recording it can mean that if people don't make the meeting, you're giving them a chance to see what happened. So moving on to workshops, again, over communication as well is useful, but also seeking support for workshops. And I've learned that through my experience. Workshops are really good online when you're using a tool like Miro or Mural, if you've had a chance to use them. We've basically been using Miro non-stop in the role that I have at the moment. It's a virtual space to collaborate. So where we used to put post-it notes on walls in meeting rooms, and that's how we used to run a workshop, we now can add those notes digitally. But also remember that not everyone knows how to use these tools. So having a little bit of an intro, having a short recording and reminding people how to interact with the tools is always a good way of keeping it inclusive and accessible. We've had some good fun with icebreakers, and so I always recommend, if you're doing a workshop, have like a quick icebreaker at the beginning. And some of the ones that we've used are, we will have some GIFs in a board where you can select one which represents your mood for the day. So you can have like people really happy, people sad, people confused. You could have whatever you want there, but it's just a bit of fun to kind of break the ice. And another one is emoji stories. So we did one where we asked people to talk about their first job, but they did that by representing it with emojis, and then you might have to guess what they were trying to represent, and then they could tell you the story. So that's just another kind of fun way of getting the people in the workshop to feel they get to know each other a bit. And so the support comes in where I think if you're running a workshop, facilitation is really hard. So if I was trying to move post-its around on the screen right now and I was trying to keep track of what multiple people were saying, I might get a bit overwhelmed. So I'd ask someone else in the session to maybe help me with grouping notes on the screen, or I might help them to ask them to help me read through the chat, things like that, so that you don't have to take it all on yourself. You can have a couple of people in a session being responsible for keeping it running smoothly. And always have a practice run, because workshops, I think, especially in my kind of role, you think it's easy, but it's always a bit harder than you think to keep a good experience for everyone. So practice makes perfect. And then moving on to presentations like this one. So again, hopefully I've demonstrated this a bit, but if I haven't, give some feedback in the chat, and if there's any questions on this, let me know. I've put ask for feedback, so I've got to live by that principle. So use images to tell stories. I think that helps. Assuming a positive intent, I put that one on there because I think, again, for me, preparing for presentations, I'm not necessarily going to know who's going to be in the audience, but I'm assuming everyone's here with positive mindset to listen to what I'm saying, and that helps as well going into the preparation. Try to bring a personal perspective and tell a bit of a story about what the subject means to you, because we've all got a different perspective to offer. Owning the Zoom room is about the fact that one of the cool things about presenting, I think, is that it's kind of your show, so you have a chance to ask people to contribute. You can set the tone for how you want it to run, and it's great to have those opportunities, so try to enjoy that. Always good to have an exec summary of the key takeouts that you want, and you can share that afterwards, and that's also something you can share with people who maybe don't make the meeting. And then there are some tools there, Google Slides, Canva and Figma. These are all really, really good tools, particularly for collaborating. So they let you make slides, but you can also easily share them with other people. So I found that to be really helpful. All right, so now moving on, just a couple more slides. Asynchronous methods. So this is about the fact that not all events have to exist or occur at the same time. And as you might have experienced when you're working with people in different time zones, it can just be really hard to schedule a meeting or a presentation at a convenient time for everybody. And if you do that, it can be hard. You've got some people dialing in, it might be the end of their day, it might be the middle of their night. It doesn't always work as well. So here's some tips for that. I really like to record short videos using Loom. That's just a tool that there are other ones available. It allows you to record videos where you explain an idea, you can record your screen, and then you can say to people, this is what I mean. The cool thing about that is you share that and they can watch it in their own time. So you can watch it, they can see what you want them to do or what you want to communicate, and they can get back to you. Also, you can have editable meeting agendas in Slack, Google Docs as well. And that means that other people can add to the agenda at a good time for them. And then we use a lot of polls or typeform surveys to collect feedback. So if you can't get people together in a meeting, maybe you can just put a quick poll saying, what should we do about X thing? What's the best day for us to organise something? What do people think? And then it allows people to contribute in that way as well. So that's really helpful, I think, in the remote working culture. Okay, so changing the tone a little bit, thinking about your experiences. What impact does being recognised for your work have? I'm going to check the chat and see. You mentioned a bit about some more tips from yourself. You mentioned having the camera on if you're in a meeting. Encourage everyone to have camera on, and you can better express yourself. Yeah, that makes sense. Reminder to use the Q&A function if you have questions. So talking about recognition, I'm going to move on to explain what impact I think it has and why this is important. And this relates really to my current role. So my role in Workhuman is a company that allows social recognition to happen between people who work at the same company. And I'm talking a bit about what that means here. So social recognition or peer-to-peer recognition is an important type of communication. It's basically you saying thanks to people you work with for what they do. And it assumes positive intent and empathy for others, other kind of principles that we're using here. So I put on the left-hand side of the screen what that looks like, and this is the products that Workhuman has, and this is what an award looks like. So someone will type in a message for what they're thanking you for, and they give you some feedback. And it can be as simple as thank you for this. It can be a more detailed shout out, and we give people points in relation to these awards, which can be then used. They have a monetary value, so I can then collect these points and I can use them to get myself something. It could be a coffee machine, or I might use them for an Amazon voucher, so I can buy a book, something like that. And this is the product that Workhuman has, but it's also really part of the culture. And Workhuman culture is all about making work more human, and the clue's in the title. But it's been really, really effective. And there is data to back up the value of recognition. As the example there shows, LinkedIn used the tool, and they found that when people are recognised more than 4 times or 4+ times a year, they had a retention rate of 96%. So that means that people are less likely to leave companies if they're getting regularly recognised for their efforts. But I think it's also about good karma. So I know that we use this at Flatiron School. We would give shout outs to people for helping us with things, and it creates a good working environment. We recognise people not just for their good work, but we also recognise personal milestones, things that are going on in your life, things that are happening for you. And if you complete an education programme, we can say well done for that, and it builds connection and belonging. So one of the things I wanted to highlight by showing this particular image is it was in a point in my life which was a bit tough. This was about 6 months ago. I fell and I broke my wrist, and that was at home, working at home. So it was hard. I'm smiling in the picture, but it was very painful. It involved multiple x-rays and trips to the hospital, and it's kind of hard to do things with a broken wrist, things like cooking, making washing your hair, making dinner, everything. Like, there was quite a lot of stuff that was harder for me to do. But I was joining my calls at the time. We were organising a hackathon at work, so this message was really boosting me because they were recognising that I was still kind of managing to do what I needed to do, but also I was trying to make the best of the situation that was a little bit tough. And these kind of messages, they really, really help. I've really noticed the impact. So I would say to everyone, thank a colleague today. Remember that these kind of messages can have huge value in the culture and times that we live in. Okay, so coming now to the end of the slides, and I just want to summarize again kind of principles here that I believe will help you be successful in your communicating. Assume positive intent, over communicate, have empathy for others, and seek support.